Without, I hope everybody's feeling sort of replenished and refreshed. It's really lovely just to observe the chat and over the break, and it doing exactly what we want PARC things to do, with people making those connections and joining up research ideas. And so that is, excuse me, that's beautiful to see. So I'm sure our next presentations are going to trigger exactly the same kinds of responses. I have no doubt. So we'll move on to our first, which is Katrine Callander, whose presentation is "Who Decides What Counts? Autistic Women, Trauma and the Politics of Recognition." So over to you. Oh, and are you happy for me to record, Katrine?
Of course, I'm very
Lovely.
happy to record.
Thank you.
And
So
to share
over
the
to
slides
you.
afterwards. So that's
Perfect.
fine. Yeah, I've also found the chat really interesting. So kind of post some good recommendations. I love being part of PARC events because there's always people always come from really interesting areas and share some really fascinating stuff. So it's brilliant.
Lots of academic generosity, I find.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah, so thank you. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to present today. So I want to begin essentially with a question that has partially shaped my doctoral research. Who decides what counts? And what counts as trauma? What counts as harm? And who decides whether that suffering becomes legitimate? So the presentation draws on participatory life story research there with late diagnosed autistic women. And I am indeed a late diagnosed or late identifying autistic woman myself. It was grounded in personal narratives, and I'm presenting lived experience. That's the core of what my research is about. Bigger, but also how lives are heard depends on some of these systems of recognition. Because across the narratives, one pattern became really unmistakable, that the harm was not absent, but whether it was counted by the surrounding systems depended on who was listening and within which system. So it is fairly well established that autistic individuals, particularly autistic women, as that's been my core focus, experience disproportionately high rates of violence and harm. These are just some examples of some of the large-scale studies that report extraordinarily high rates of sexual assault and domestic violence and other forms of violence and harm. So the scale of harm is not in question. But something else emerged in these narratives, that even when this harm occurred, it did not always become legible as harm. And that raised a different kind of question. Because what if trauma is not only about what happens, but about whether what happens is indeed recognized as harm? Because harm must be recognized to access support. So we often think about trauma as events-based. Something happens, something extreme, something identifiable, and those experiences were present too. The severe violence, assault, crisis on many different levels. And I was very, very grateful to the large number of individuals. I spoke to 62 who were willing to share their experiences with me. But many of them also describe something more gradual. The repetition, the invalidation, the gradually wearing down, silencing, which often preceded more visible forms of harm. So it wasn't only this rupture, this visible rupture, but the accumulation. And many hesitated to call it trauma, at least initially, particularly before the identification as well. And not because it didn't cause harm, because they were unsure that it would count. And that uncertainty did not occur in isolation. It followed them into institutions, into schools, into diagnostic systems, mental health frameworks, into safeguarding processes, even into police reporting. And because that recognition happened within these systems of authority. And when those patterns travel across these sections and these settings, they accumulate. So rather than asking how traumatized are autistic individuals or autistic women, even though that question remains very urgent, I ask, why is that trauma dismissed? How does that misrecognition become patterned, and how might those patterns change? Because my central position, my central claim is this, that trauma is mediated by these systems of recognition. And whether distress is acknowledged depends on how it aligns with those institutional expectations. So I'll move through 3 stages in this presentation. First, how recognition is structured. Second, how that misrecognition becomes formalized and experienced in autistic lives. And third, what that means both for participatory research and indeed epistemic justice. So before we look at how it's experienced, we just take a bit of a step back. I'm not going to dive heavily into kind of theories and concepts, mention a few key points, but to understand how recognition operates, then we need to understand how it has been structured historically and theoretically. So at least just briefly, so that is what I want to do first. Most of us, if not all of us here, are familiar with how autism has been shaped through diagnostic systems. I could put multiple kind of like links and references here. Those systems has historically privileged certain behaviors, marginalized others. Externalized presentations were foregrounded, and internalized and mass distress were harder to see. Obviously, some of the work of people here in this room and many outside it, autistic-led scholarship and neurodiversity movements have expanded on what counts as autistic experience, though it is not always recognized across the societal systems. But the key point in relation to my research is this. Before we even talk about autistic trauma, there is already this filter in place for recognition. We're already marginalized and dismissed. And recognition is gendered. Credibility is not evenly distributed. And both Butler's work kind of on recognizability shows how those social norms determine which forms of expression becomes intelligible in the first place. Obviously, Fricker describes this as testimonial injustice, where certain speakers are granted less credibility because of who they are. And indeed, kind of David Milton's double empathy problem, as many of us know, will remind us that this understanding between autistic and non-autistic people is relational, not located solely within autistic individuals. So that kind of pins the basis on how distress must look right to be believed. And my participants, my interlocutors, describe these persistent double binds because we would maybe too outwardly controlled if we dissociated or shut down to appear distressed. Sometimes they were too articulate to be considered autistic. Maybe sometimes too emotional to be considered reliable. So their distress, or how they presented based on traumatic events, was assessed for conformity. And when it didn't align with expectations, it was minimized, reframed. Essentially, what I'm saying here is that this is patterned. It's not accidental. It's not one-off. It is seen across the board. Because it doesn't occur in a vacuum. It is formalized within institutional templates. The diagnostic criteria, safeguarding thresholds, police reporting processes, they all rely on established scripts of what trauma should look like. There may be a slight move in terms of that, in terms of experts by experience, in terms of being a little bit more aware of different presentations. Let us just say my participants, and myself included, have certainly experienced dismissal when not presenting what was expected. And the thing is that those scripts, they shape interpretation, because the distress must be aligned within the recognized category. And if not, it might be individualized or psychologized, attributed to anxiety or other diagnosis, to personality. If we do have a diagnosis or identifier, some of our traits can be kind of linked back to autism itself. That is why we are vulnerable. That is why we are at risk. And that recognition determines what becomes recordable. And what becomes recordable determines what becomes eligible for support. And when those interpretations repeat, something else begins to happen. Of course, when misrecognition happens once, a few times, of course it hurts, it harms. But when it repeats across years, across decades, it reshapes how you understand yourself. And over time, that disbelief becomes familiar. The dismissal becomes something you anticipate. Bourdieu was one of the ones who described it as symbolic violence, when patterns of dismissal becomes taken for granted. And that external misrecognition becomes the internal doubt. You begin to question your perceptions, your needs, your boundaries. Like Juniper, one of my kind of anonymized participants, captured it this way, that she says, the cumulative kind of slow feeding of not being believed. It just goes on the backbone and becomes something that you start to believe. That suggests something embodied, something carried. And if this part one showed how misrecognition is structured, I could have pulled in many other papers, many other forms of research. My part two shows what happens when those structures are lived and reinforced, and I have a few additional quotes I would like to share with you. Because what this meant in real life and across these narratives was that participants learned to manage how they were read, and this was possible. Clara described presenting in a seemingly emotionless way, and that she found it hard to express myself. I was often heavily masking. So it wasn't an absence of distress, but how it was interpreted. Participants became aware that credibility depended on the presentation. We became aware about visible emotion, coherence, intensity. Otherwise, it was minimized and doubted. So recognizability in this sense became a gatekeeping mechanism. Some describe trying to translate themselves, to adjust tone, to adjust facial expressions, body language, to emphasize certain details and make their distress readable. But often in those scenarios, that translation required capacity, it required spoons. And sometimes, very often, this was not possible, particularly if it has been based on a long experience of various forms of trauma. When they could not perform this distress in expected ways, when they couldn't translate themselves, ourselves, they were not believed. And when that negotiation also enters diagnostic systems, mental health systems, that misrecognition became formalized. And participants described, like for example, Nina here, they called it a cascade effect in relation to mental health. It was kind of one mental condition going on to another, a cascade effect, and my life really, really fell into disrepair. Because he said it was not an isolated instance for her or for others. Multiple participants described similar diagnostic layering, often after experiencing trauma and requiring help. One diagnosis led to another, often without the underlying interpretive framework being questioned. For a long time, for many, autism wasn't even considered a possibility. And instead, their distress, either linked to trauma or linked to the undiagnosed kind of like marginalization, was translated into personality disorders, bipolar, anxiety, depression, other labels that many of us have come up against. Sometimes PTSD, but without questioning the broader context. And the thing was, those interpretations of that distress was written down, often traveled across services, shaped professional responses, not just in one scenario, but across other settings as well. And they shaped what was believed. And once recorded, they became difficult to undo. And they shaped how participants came to understand themselves. And indeed, crucially, how future harm was interpreted. So again, they stopped seeing their needs and not kind of recognizing boundaries. When misrecognition reshapes self-understanding, that vulnerability can begin to feel inevitable. And Diana described this shift as a lot of us just end up accepting abuse because we learn that is just how the world is. That acceptance is not naivety, that is learned, that is constructed, that is imposed upon us. And described internalizing the blame. I should have known, I should have seen the signs. And what began as external doubt then became the self-surveillance. Clara mentioned, I find it hard to understand and assert my own boundaries or even trust myself. So trauma risk becomes normalized. Vulnerability is framed as inherent. But what appears as fragility is that accumulated effect of patterned misrecognition. And vulnerability here is then socially produced, not inherently kind of related to our autistic traits. So part 3, what does this mean? What can we do? And no, I don't have all the answers. But if misrecognition produces vulnerability, then changing who gets to define harm becomes a matter of justice. Sienna described this as you're very much a case, an item, a unit in a process, rather than a human being. They describe becoming these procedural objects rather than relational individuals in their own right. It links back to the recognition is not neutral, that it carries authority. And if it carries authority, then that carries responsibility. So then we have to ask not only who currently defines harm, but who should. Because across the accounts, the harm was present, but often misread. It was often reclassified or minimized. And the changing recognition is not just about awareness. It requires redistributing that interpretive authority. Because autistic narratives should not be supplementary. They're knowledge. We are knowledge. Our lived experience matters. And participatory research, a point of kind of why we're getting together and talking here, it matters because it shifts. It aims to shift and support shifting who gets to define distress, who gets to name harm, and who gets to shape support. Because when that recognition is shared, then distress does not need to be performed to be believed. The diagnostic frameworks should then remain open to revision, and cumulative and relational harms can be seen as named as trauma, as recognized as trauma. So we return to the question, who decides what counts as harm, who gets to name it, and whose suffering becomes legitimate. We could have a further discussion about what would recognition look like if autistic people defined it. And I've seen some excellent work just over the last couple of years in this field. If we kind of share our experiences. If trauma is mediated by systems of recognition, then justice requires transforming those systems. And the participatory work, including the work being done within this collective, showed that those most often misrecognized are also those best shaped to reshape the terms of recognition. So the question is not only who decides what counts, but how we change to get to decide. And I think we're already making some progress. So let's keep up that work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrine. Thank you very much indeed. Again, as with our previous presentations, lots of triggered lots of discussion.
Just seeing it coming in. I'm not too sure I can follow all of it, but
there was a question similar to the question that Tyler had. So a question from LB. I think you said you had 62 participants, didn't you? So how do you navigate conducting this research when so many of us share similar experiences? So LB said they found it tricky transcribing interviews about meltdowns and shutdowns, and listening to it kind of elicits strong feelings. So how did you look after yourself?
I think it came down to what I was trying to achieve initially. Number one, I've had excellent support from my supervisors, of course, which Damien is one. So that being understood by my supervisory team and by the university has made a big difference. I think being very, from the beginning of reaching out, I was very open about my own positionality as a member of the community. And if anything, I actually found it, if not therapeutic, then supportive that I wasn't the only one who had experienced some of these patterns. I did include too many people in my research. I ended up with over 1 million words of data, which was intense to transcribe. I think I have enough material to write another couple of PhDs or some postdoctoral work. But you know what? The reason why I spoke to so many was because I opened it up, and I had a lot of people contact me willing to share their narratives. And I was aware that for many, this material, their narratives, their story had not been heard. They had been dismissed. They had not been listened to. They had not had a voice. I did not want to be another person who said, no, you can't contribute. So I wanted to hear. I wanted to be there. I wanted to validate their narrative. And that meant, yes, navigating a lot of data, navigating a lot of narratives. But it made me feel I might not be able to change the systems that we're talking about. But by opening up and by sharing those perspectives, I feel that there's a little difference we can make in terms of being heard. And so that was how I navigated it, and it has made me feel being part of that voice and being part of that kind of those voices, and then sharing that is what has then helped my well-being as well.
There's a question that follows on from that, because there's a real and I apologize because I saw it, but I can't remember who wrote it. There's a real risk of sort of re-traumatization for you. So how did you kind of protect yourself specifically?
I was very happy we're fortunate to be able to have a mentoring service at the university. So I have someone to speak to and kind of share that I then still here at the end, right at the end of my PhD, was able to so I've known this person for years now, and we've gone through, I've seen them weekly. So if anyone is still doing their research and are not then fight for some of those accommodations and some of that support, which we are entitled to. I also have a lovely supportive family, which helps with that aspect. Being part of a fully neurodivergent family as well. Thankfully, within our family, we have, and I have young people as well, because it also came up. I've got a 21-year-old daughter, neurodivergent daughter. And it actually opened up some conversations about how do we prepare, and I know that, by the way, I know that this is not related to just girls and women. It is related not just autistic individuals, but often various forms of neurodivergent individuals, and of different ethnicities or sexual orientation. But yeah, being able to have the language and be able to communicate and being very open and talking about it and sharing things. So I think it has made a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question from Mary about you just raised then about different intersections. Did you find any specific data on misrecognition for Black autistic women? Because racism is often misrecognized as well as autism, and how that feeds into a recognition of trauma.
What was interesting, actually, that I had a vast majority of white participants, and it was kind of, I opened it up to everyone, and I just and I think that could maybe relate to kind of how autism is seen in different communities. I think we do far more research in this area. There was quite a lot of other intersectionalities, different kind of different sexualities, a lot of different age groups, several from kind of mixed ethnicity backgrounds. And it was interesting in terms kind of like I've just noticed here, kind of like also non-binary individuals were considered. I did have to make a choice to focus on, and there were some trans women kind of in my research as well, who identified as women. But I also feel I didn't want to solely focus on that aspect. I have generally talked about various intersectionalities, so the gendered aspects, the kind of age aspect, and thinking. Sorry, I'm just looking out in the chat because they came up. I have not looked at anyone that came about displaced people, so I think there's far more research. And I would be very happy to continue going into a postdoctoral research within this and diving into more specific intersectional aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got a life's work with a million words, haven't you? Haven't you? A question from Soph. I'm wondering if not being allowed anger and rage was a theme that you encountered in your work. And whether, particularly whether that's gendered as well.
Yes, very much so. But again, I think that internalization aspect became kind of it became crucially important. And I saw it as people describe, because this was narrative life story interviews. So I had, for most of my participants, I had multiple interviews. Because also trust builds up over time. You can't just ask about trauma. So I with very open questions, please tell me about your life. Please tell me about your early life. And my participants took it in whatever direction they wanted to, because I wanted it to be their life story. So anger came up. Yes, a lot of anger came up after identification and after diagnosis. If someone wanted to participate, to approach a diagnosis, many were happy with identification generally. Of like, why has no one heard me, seen me, experienced? Why have I been dismissed over the kind of so the anger and that is a big part of what I probably focus on next. One thing is the trauma and not being seen. Then what actually happens, that process when we start to see ourselves and actually start to find, hey, kind of, why have I not been seen? And I support that anger. I really appreciate the anger, because in some ways, I think we need to be angry. We need to be in a constructive way, but we need to challenge those and kind of challenge the anger into kind of like, why is this happening? Why has it been allowed to happen for such a long time? And if I can also mention, by the way, I'm not saying that trauma isn't real until it's recognized. Any form of harm is real regardless of recognition. But I think part of my research is that harm sometimes only becomes legitimized within the systems, and our access to support, our access to diagnosis, our access to justice. So it's about authorization. The harm is still very real, very valid. And we should be allowed to be angry about that.
Yeah, and righteous anger, absolutely. I'm conscious that we've about
Oh,
our
yeah, we've gone
time,
over,
and
so sorry.
no,
By the way,
no,
can I
we're
just
no.
pick up on Mary's kind of, yes, absolutely. It's not about blaming the lack of Black participants in the kind of either in the movement or in kind of, I think it is the systems that definitely misdiagnose and exclude and dismiss Black women and other intersectionalities as well. So.
Thank you so much, Katrine. I mean, please take time to read the comments, and because it's impossible as you're presenting and answering questions, and you can see them kind of firing up. But yeah, so lots of
we would love to speak to anyone. So if anyone are happy to get in touch, then I would love to kind of speak further about this. So thank you so much for listening.
As we said with Liam and Tyler, please, if you're happy to do that, just put your email in the chat, and then people can contact you. So wonderful. So thank you once again.
Thank you so
for sharing
much.
your work. All right.